Okay. All right. So as you remember, in the first session, we had talked about conflicting values. So we have the values of inclusion, and we have other values as well that are in tension, and often we're not acknowledging the tension. And so we're not necessarily expressing the values that we're stating. And then last time, our conversation kind of surfaced one of the key tensions, which is between the traditional forms, for example, in Zen practice, the traditional forms, between those requirements and the requirements or the needs for inclusivity. And what we're going to talk about today is about power, namely who gets to decide what is essential, who will be included, so on and so forth. And that's obviously a critical aspect of gathering in our sanghas. So Rhonda is going to talk to us about right uses of power. Mushim and I are going to talk a little bit about the East Bay Meditation Center, which, while not perfect, is certainly a very interesting place. And hopefully what we've been through can be helpful to others. So I think with that, let me turn it over to Rhonda.
Well, hello, everyone. It's, as always, a privilege and honor to be with you. Again, coming to you from San Francisco, California. And again, during this beautiful period of both challenge and so many different opportunities, I'm really appreciating the time, energy, commitment each of you is bringing to this invitation to create a teaching and learning and practice space around these themes of deepening and exploring what inclusivity looks like, what equity and inclusion look like in our sanghas in the face of the challenges that present by the context that we're in, the histories we have inherited, and the different rivers of some of the ways that the legacies of those histories are in us, in the systems that we create that have formed us as well, and are in, therefore, our sanghas. So I'm going to spend the next 15 or so minutes just really inviting us to kind of turn to sort of pick up where we left off, or add this different dimension of the conversation that Crystal was highlighting, inviting us to really look at power. When we think about racism, I think it's really important for us to understand that we're talking about a concept that is about maybe one way of thinking about it certainly is to think about the intersection between, again, these ways that we have imbibed lessons about who matters, who doesn't, whose voices matter, don't bias, prejudice, right? A predilection, a kind of an affinity, a kind of tendency to value certain types of perspectives and experiences, racialized and racially categorized beings, to speak specifically about the race dimension here. In our context, we have been traditionally over and over and over again rewarded for centering, honoring, privileging, including white-bodied experience, white perspectives. That's one of the legacies, of course, of white supremacy. And so that orientation, then when coupled with power, can lead to, even in ways that are sometimes unintentional, but unfortunately sometimes ways that are intentional, harmful consequences, the contemporary sort of maintenance of these hierarchies, including maintenance of racial hierarchy, even in our practice communities. So in preparing for this talk, we invited you all to listen to a number of different presentations and to really read an essay by Mushim, so a presentation by Duncan Williams, a teacher of Buddhism, a presentation that I did. Both of those were in the Harvard Buddhism and Race Conference series. Again, if you didn't have a chance to kind of look at those in preparation, please take a look at them. And then Mushim's piece on what it really means to explore allyship. And so I'm just mentioning those because I think all of us in our different ways, in the materials that we asked you to look at for today, in different ways, we were inviting reflection on how we might use and draw on power, the right use of power to minimize bias, community building, to minimize the sense of our being stuck in cultures, in institutions, in sanghas, frankly, or in patterns within our sanghas that are seeking to kind of, in some way, resist the call for transformation that I think Buddhist practice and teachings are really fundamentally inviting us all into. So really, in a way, we're looking at how do we get stuck, right? Even in the midst of this beautiful work that we're doing, how do we get stuck? And how might the right use of the power that we have be a part of how we get unstuck? I'll say that the phrase right use of power for me comes from this beautiful book, right? By Dr. Cedar Barstow. So another text and resource for those who are looking for texts and resources to do this work. And so there's so much more in this book than I'm going to be able to obviously summarize here. But I do want to just name that what I want to highlight about her project is this call to integrate our ethics, right, our ethical commitments with our exercise of the power that we all have. And again, I'm going to say that, you know, that power is something that everybody has, not necessarily equally. So we'll talk a little bit about, we want to think about the different ways that power operates and shows up, and recognizing multidimensionality in terms of this thing we call power. But freedom or liberation or right relationship with power, at least in the theory of Dr. Barstow that we want to sort of offer as a support for our thinking here, involves an integration of our ethical commitments with our dynamic engagement with power. She often, and I love the way she often uses references to heart. So we're not just talking about, so we're thinking about ethics in a broad sense, and we're thinking about power in a broad sense. We're not just thinking about ethics in terms of rules that somebody set forth that we, you know, or even precepts that someone set forth and we're trying to live, although these are important ways of thinking about what we mean by ethics, but even more broadly, what's the heart and broad aspiration underneath this idea of ethics? To me, it really invites us to deeply think about and be with how we want to live in the short time we have on the planet. How do you want to live? How do we want to live today? How do we want to live this hour and a half? How do we want to be? So really allowing a kind of a call to an ethical engagement with power to be seen through this broad lens of kind of living ethics. Not just this idea of a set of codes that we know about and we point to. How is it showing up and how we're meeting people? How is it showing up and how we're supporting people on the path of their engagement in our sanghas and in our teaching and learning communities? How is it showing up in those resources that we point to, and literally how we shape the environment in which people come together? So it's a lived ethics that we're talking about. And the power that we're talking about has these multiple dimensions. We all have personal power. but we also have differential access to different sources of power, status-related power that might be tied to our identities in time and place and context. So that's where we might think a little bit about privileged identities and how those might be shown up in spaces. And again, the privileges can be around a lot of different identity dimensions. Here, we're specifically trying to keep an eye on how race shows up and and whiteness, because that's what we're particularly trying to work with here. But we know that that intersects with so many different types of identities, and all of that matters when we're trying to really get a hand on, frankly, the dynamics of domination, right? The different ways any one of us might be seduced or invited to kind of lean into the trainings of our culture that justify oppression. So when we think about right use of power, we want to think about bringing in a lived, embodied ethics, a way of being founded in love and respect for each other, founded in an appreciation of our own agency. Okay, so that's the first approximation of power. I have power as an individual, even in a world where I'm formed by institutions and a social structure. There is still some way that I have an opportunity in the midst of that. So that both and that multidimensionality of what it is to be a being moving through the world. Looking at our own individual agency, the power that we have, regardless of our status-based power, our identity-based power, but then to also look at status-based power, identity-based power, and how that is distributed in our sanghas and in our communities. So what demographics are predominant and what are the impacts and implications of those things is something we have to take seriously and look at. And then thinking about the differentiated degrees to which we have more official, institutional, formal power, right? So some people are in leadership positions. Some people are in the position of facilitating this conversation or that. And again, as we think about how to use the various aspects of the power that we have, and maybe particularly in this context to push to the fore for our reflections, thinking about identity-based power and privilege, race-based power and privilege, and the way in which certain organizations will have the characteristics that should suggest one set of race or group, maybe more. Again, historically in the United States, we know we're dealing with whiteness as the dominant group, and often in our sanghas, not always. How do we then pull forward a little bit the inquiry into how we might become more insightful about how power is operating, more intelligent? Cedar Barso talks about like power intelligence as opposed to power blindness, right? So we're trying to open up that aperture. I'm going to say for myself, looking at power closely is not something I was born doing. I'm not sure any of us necessarily is, but I know my own body, being in spirit, it was hard. It still in some ways is difficult for me, but it's gotten easier to turn toward examination of this thing called power. I think I had this idea that those who are empowered were probably going to use it against people like me. So I had at least some ambivalence about this conversation about power. And yet, power in and of itself might be seen as a neutral dynamic. It can be used as a force for good or not good, or its opposite. So bringing intentionality then to this aspect of concentrated, forceful energy, the capacity to influence, the capacity to have an effect, bringing intentionality to that is not a bad thing. But we often haven't had opportunities to reflect. So when in thinking about how we might create more equitable and inclusive places for coming together and learning, to create some space for reflection on, well, how do these more equitable and inclusive spaces come to be? And how might the right use of our power be an important, aspect of the work that we are coming together to do to make our communities more inclusive? And what is that, the curriculum around being in right relationship with power? What does that look like for each of us? What assumptions, hidden, obvious and not obvious assumptions, do I have about who should be in power, who shouldn't? How might some of the ways that I've become comfortable with the maldistribution of power that I see around me, and perhaps the way it is disproportionately arrayed in ways that look similar to the kinds of, organizations or manifestations of who is in power that would be so if we were seeking to order our lives through white supremacy. In other words, sometimes, we know we're not intending to replicate the patterns of these histories. And yet, even unintentionally, we look around and we've created a circumstance in which it looks like the outcomes are, but for a little bit, similar. We've got, again, those who tend to have the power to decide what resources to rely on, what the pathway to training will be, what the criteria for elevation will be, is concentrated in certain hands and bodies. And again, so part of what we want to do is sort of look at the relationship between the histories that we have been imbibing, mostly unconsciously, around prioritizing whiteness, and then seeing how that might, in some way that might be difficult for us to really see, how those trainings and teachings may have become somehow, accreted or become interwoven with some of what we see as, let's say, race neutral criteria of merit in the practice, or criteria of desert or deservingness, or criteria of presumptive belonging somehow. So I'm struggling for the language a little bit, because I think, what we are doing is really trying to look at, we're trying to make what's often not visible more visible. And we're trying to look at how some of the ways we've, again, in ways that seem not about race at all, race neutral, how they have contributed to less than inclusive outcomes. And what can get tricky is that some of those race neutral features have the imprimatur or the stamp of approval of our traditions, like our tradition requires that, or we benefit on the path through this version of the way we think of the Dharma and the way we think of practice and the way we think of Sangha. We benefit if we do these things. And then if we look and ask ourselves, well, where has that gotten us in terms of our demographics, in terms of a sense of inclusivity that enables people from a wide variety of backgrounds to feel at home here? And if it looks like by adhering to some of these, we may find that we look at the traditions that we've imbibed and the commitments we have, and we might be able to look around and say, by adhering to these traditions, principles, indicia of merit, et cetera, this is the outcome in terms of diversity or not, demographic reality. And then sitting with sitting in the fire of that is what I think we're inviting. And we may come out the other side of this fire saying, this is who we are. we realize that the ways we are holding tradition, the ways we are inviting people in are not that inclusive, or let's say lead to results that if we look around, we say, wow, people of color come into this place and tell us again and again, it doesn't feel that welcoming, right? We may have to kind of sit with these difficult realities. And the invitation is to sort of discern, how would we choose to be in relationship with these realities if we're willing to see them for what they are? In law, of course, we have a long tradition of anti-discrimination law, which invites kind of a looking at the same set of facts and the various parties who have been impacted by these sets of facts, kind of telling stories about what they mean. And of course, those who interpret the meaning have traditionally, those lawyers and then judges, and certainly Supreme Court judges who have are the ultimate arbiters of, what our Constitution demands, requires in terms of civil rights, and including the rights governing anti-discrimination law. They have disproportionately been white men. All of the arbiters of what constitutes racial equality have disproportionately been white and male. And because of that, we had something called critical race theory emerge, which basically said, wow, the people whose perspectives determine again and again what justice looks like are coming from this one set of backgrounds disproportionately. They're coming from a set of backgrounds that have kind of benefited from the dominant structures of oppression. And so people in law had actually been struggling for many years, but came up with this critical theory approach, critical race theory, which has all kinds of critical gender, feminist criticism, queer criticism, right? This set of approaches that looked at law, these traditional systems, and would bring the lived experience of people who were kind of traditionally marginalized into the conversation about, wait a minute, we understand the even race neutral, gender neutral, sex orientation neutral ways that you're justifying these outcomes. But we're here to tell you there's pain that's still happening. And challenging, right, that this body of critical narrative, if you will, because it started with people telling their stories. How are we still being harmed here? We know you're telling us that the Equal Protection Clause exists, that we have the 14th Amendment, we have all this anti-discrimination law, and yet inequality is still happening. Power hasn't shifted out of the hands of the traditional empowered people very much. So those critical perspectives on law kept and still continue to shine a light on the kind of disconnect between the kind of stated values. Now we're coming back to what we've been talking about here. What's the disconnect between our stated values around inclusivity, around openness to all, types of people being included? What's the disconnect between that and the outcomes? Who's in our sanghas? Who seems to feel included and safe? What's the disconnect between those stated values and the actions we would be willing to take to make the sanghas more inclusive? So to have that courage to kind of turn toward with a kind of commitment to doing what we can individually, interpersonally, and collectively to first get clear on where we are. This is who we are. This is what we say we stand for. These is if we kind of are willing to take a look to see where we are, this is who we are, notwithstanding what we say we stand for. If we see there's a gap, what are we willing to do to try to address that? What are we not willing to do? So part of what we want to invite with this session is kind of a deepening of the capacity for courageous and clarifying conversations about how we've come to be in the places that we're in terms of these communities that sometimes we are told by our members don't feel so inclusive, don't feel so safe for people like this group or the other. So we're going to then create an opportunity for you to go into small groups to reflect on these questions about how it is that non-obvious legacies of dominator culture. And again, this is white supremacist, but also intersecting with patriarchal and elite culture, and all the different ways that we become acculturated to a kind of normalization of dominator culture in the broad culture. How has some of that shown up in our sanghas? Okay. And when we look at some of the ways that our actual dharmic practices and traditions are presented in our communities, are there ways that those practices reflect a maldistribution of power? Are the people in charge disproportionately of a certain demographic? Because we really want to get real about where we are, and looking at who has power, who becomes in positions of authority, who becomes in positions of interpretation of what Dharma requires, interpretation of what tradition requires. And again, how might dominator cultures of a variety of sorts, by the way, not only white supremacist cultures, again, there are many different ways dominator culture might be in this. How might that be something that the context of the United States today and the communities that we're wanting to create today might demand that we explore, or might be, let's say if not demand, might be knocking on our door to invite us to inquire how we might do this a little bit differently. So yeah, we're naming there might be some tension between the values of inclusivity on the one hand and some notion of traditionality on the other. Maybe not, but this is where we want to get real, because what I'm saying, let me just pull back the curtain a little bit. We are presenting this as a set of questions for you to reflect on, because in our experience, mine, Mushim, Crystal's, others who've been on this racial justice, diversity, equity, inclusion pathway for some years, we've often found that we've had these sessions like this and people are like, yes, for inclusivity, yes, for diversity. And then they go away and say, but that actually won't work in our, we're not going to change very much because our tradition requires. And then we find that nothing has really changed. 5 years go past, 10, and we're coming back to the same issues. Am I the only one who's noticed this? Those of you who have been in the storm so long, I know. So we want this to be a place where at least we can say, yeah, we came together with that hard question on the table. We didn't wait till we went home and looked at that. So we at least created space to look at it here. We're not saying we're going to resolve the tensions here, but we are saying by leaning into our practices, we can deepen our capacity to stay in the fire of what's real, what really needs to be addressed if we're going to make change, and what things we're not willing to change, even as we turn toward addressing these issues as best we can.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. So we would like to offer you now a chance to be in small groups. So here's how I've distilled down that beautiful talk. Like, the question that we're inviting you to consider is, where do you see the tensions between the values of inclusion and what is considered traditional, or kind of the way we do things in your Sangha? And the more kind of clear and plain that we can be with ourselves and with each other, I think the richer these conversations are gonna be. So we've set aside more time for these groups than we did in the first two meetings, which I hope is welcome. And we'll come back at the hour. So we're at 28 minutes now, probably 27 by the time the groups are set up. And so we invite you to first do a round, so offer each person, let's say 4 minutes of simply talking out loud and active listening on everyone else's part. So this is the part where it's really important to get all the voices present in the conversation. And so if you don't use your 4 minutes, we invite you to simply pause and sit silently with the group and see if something else arises. So you'll need a timekeeper, of course. And then after that round of 4 minutes each, then kind of open conversation or just do another round as you like. And so we'll come back together at the top of the hour. And yeah.
This is Mushim. I'd just like to pipe up. I was teaching another class this morning, so I just zoomed in a few minutes late. I was eating my lunch. Brilliant talk, Rhonda. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. What I'd like to say is that speaking for myself, possibly for our team, we do recognize, we do understand that we're entering brave conversations and we're not all on a level playing field. I have been in a number of Buddhist organizations. And so, of course, if I'm going to speak up, frankly, about something, I am weighing in my mind the impact this might have on my abbot of any gender or people who are in a position to have power over how I live, what pressures might be exerted on me in my spiritual community, what critiques and so forth. So I want to really just acknowledge that and ask, beg, implore, invite all of us to try to enter into a space in which we're deeply and compassionately listening to one another, receiving one another's realities, and really upholding in our hearts the commitment that we would like to create a world that works for all to the extent that we can. That's my request. Thank you.
Thank you, Mushim. Well said. Okay. So Betsy, when you're ready? We are ready.
Crystal, I thought I'd pop up the screen share one more time for people to rename themselves if they want to get into.
Oh, that's a good idea. Thank you. Thank you for remembering that. So if you missed this in the beginning, we're inviting those who are BIPOC and wanting a BIPOC group to rename yourself with @ before your name. And if you're biracial or multiracial and would like a biracial, multiracial breakout group, to rename yourself with the # in front of your name. And if you're white and would like a white breakout group, to put the ampersand in front of your name. And then everyone else will be assigned more or less randomly. So Mushim is a core teacher at the East Bay Meditation Center. I believe that you were a founding member on the original Leadership Sangha and is still our community director as well. So Mushim has really been and Mushim teaches, I think now in your 8th year, the Practice into Transformative Action program, which is really one of the sort of, I think, cultural bases for the things that we do 9 years do at the East Bay Meditation Center. I'm on the Leadership Sangha, which is what we call our board. And Mushim and I together are founding members of the Radical Inclusivity Committee at EBMC, where when people say, when we get the feedback, I don't feel included, then we spring into action and try to kind of figure out, well, what is needed here and how do we try to bring it about. So we're going to spend the rest of our time on this. And so I'm going to invite Mushim to kind of start us off. I'm going to say a few things probably after that. And then we would like to invite you into this conversation with your questions or your observations, or just however this lands with you. And again, we're not saying, oh, East Bay Meditation Center is the perfect place. This is how you need to do it. What we're saying is like, here's how we have worked to cultivate this conversation and this practice of inclusion, and the kinds of practices that our community has come up with, which will likely be different for other communities. So Mushim, let me offer that to you.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, everyone. Yes, so eastbaymeditation.org. You are all invited to come and browse around on our website, to click the Contact Us button and ask any question that you like. I will be the person who answers your email, and I'm generally pretty fast about doing it if I'm able to do so. So we are there for you, and please feel free to ask any question that you like. We have on our website a lot of great resources. Crystal and I have posted radical inclusivity resources. We invite you to look at that. And also, we also have a committee called the Shared Leadership Committee, which I am on. So shared leadership, radical inclusivity are 2 out of, I believe, like 5 what we call core elements of East Bay Meditation Center. Shared leadership means many things, and it usually involves a flattening, not a complete destruction of, but a flattening of hierarchical and power over structures. So that's the basis that we're starting from, that this is a good thing. This is beneficial. This aligns with our values. Your group may not feel that way, and I recognize that. So we need to start with buy-in. We need to start with affirmation from, from the Sangha saying, yeah, this is a personal journey for those of us who have been trained, as I have been, in very hierarchical structures. Zen Buddhism, traditionally pretty hierarchical, and that's not unnuanced. I want to say that up front. This is not either or. There are a lot of different ways that power flows, and particularly we can see in Asia, some of it is behind the scenes, and yet everyone knows it, because that's part of Asian culture is, yeah, there's stuff going on behind the shoji screens, and everyone knows it. It's weird, that's the way it is. For instance, the influence of powerful and wealthy lay women as supporters. They may look like they have no power and they're in a misogynistic system, but they pull the plug on their support and whole systems will come crashing down because they are the funders and they know it and everyone knows it. So there's a nuance there. And I remember when I came back from 8 months in the Korean monastic system in August of 1988, and the plane wheels touched down on the tarmac of San Francisco International Airport. And I just thought, thank you, God. And because I barely made it through this system, I came back $15 in my pocket, literally no hidden assets. And so I remember taking a vow at that point. I remember taking a vow, and I said to myself, all right, Mushim, you are a United Statesian. You're an American citizen. And I acknowledge these are my values, and these are my values. And I said to myself, I want my vote. I will never again willingly subject myself to a spiritual system in which I do not have a vote. Having a vote doesn't mean I win or that I get my way. What it means is I have a vote. So we can look at how we're defining shared leadership at East Bay Meditation Center. It doesn't mean everyone literally gets a vote. What it means, however, is that we practice going to the community and opening up communication avenues, exactly as Crystal said, so that people who are affected by decisions in the Sangha are invited, not allowed, invited, as is their right, to give input. Because we're never going to probably get input that is uniform and everyone says, yeah, this is the kind of community, you know, these are the policies and the ways of doing things that are fair and equitable. We will have what's called thought diversity, and we will have people. That's what diversity is. Therefore, there needs to be leadership bodies who do make decisions, and those leadership bodies do not make decisions, ideally speaking, cut off from the people whom those decisions will affect. So principles of shared leadership, as we've evolved it, we had a wonderful consultant in 2016 we brought in, and we were doing it with staff and some members of the board. Crystal, I think you were there. And she just looked at us all with no humor, like no nothing. I kept hoping to get like a little smile out of her. Not a damn thing. She looked at us and she said, you need to reduce conflict avoidance, or you can never have shared leadership. And I remember looking at her conflict avoidantly and thinking, but you know, we're like nice people. We're not going to go to war with one another. Give us a break here. Nothing. She just stared at us. And so I thought, okay, fine. And I took a Compass Point nonprofit services one-day workshop on conflict resolution with issues of power and privilege in mind. They do offer it, Compass Point. I recommend it to all of you. It really helped me reduce conflict avoidance. And I can say after an 8-hour day, I came out as a different person than when I went in as, which I can't say anything, even in my spiritual training. I can't say in one day, I started out with being one person at the end at 5 p.m. I emerged as like, wow, I'm a different person. I did from that workshop. I came out and I thought, I'm ready to do conflict. I feel so much more comfortable. I'm good. I'm in it. Let's bring it on. And so we might think in our sanghas, principle of shared leadership is how do we reduce conflict avoidance, increase comfort and ability to hold tensions and differences and conflict. Second of all, from the disability justice movement, I'll ask us to consider their motto of nothing about us without us. There's nothing that can be done about us that affects us as people with disabilities without our voices and our input and our presence. And then thirdly, for myself, following up on Rhonda's fabulous talk about power, one of the very simple and easy to remember rubrics that I use comes from Oakland activist Paul Kivel, Kivel, who says that in considering power, we might ask 3 simple questions. So I invite you to ask these questions about your Sangha. Who decides? Who benefits? And who pays? Who decides? Who benefits? And who pays? So you notice that's not personal attacks on people. It's not about, oh, you racist, bad people or personalities. It's not about that. We are good-hearted people. Some of us have taken the Bodhisattva vows. All of us are showing up here because our hearts are good. I completely believe that. However, if we have the ability to just give ourselves some space and just ask like, hey, we're gathering some information in my Sangha, who decides, who benefits from those decisions, and who pays? Then we might be able to come out with, it's kind of like an X-ray or something, you know? It doesn't matter whether we're nice or not nice or racist people. To the X-ray technician, just take the damn X-ray and it's going to show us something about looking inside at structures. Crystal, what might you add to that? Or differ from me?
I think one of the striking parts about shared leadership is the idea that, as Mushim was saying, everyone affected by a decision needs to be part of the decision-making process, and that decisions are made based on explicitly agreed upon values, goals, etc. And the way that we have conversations with each other are guided and governed by the the agreements for multicultural interactions that we shared in the first class. And so what this means is that, in a hierarchical decision-making situation, you tend to have like one person who's at the top, and that's like the final decision. And the difficulty with that, for example, in a white supremacist setting, a white dominated organization, is that white person will unconsciously and in some way consciously reproduce the very system that we're talking about disrupting. Because I, as an individual in a position of power, I kind of can't help just reproducing my own psychology, my own culture, etc. And as a white person, I have the capacity to learn a lot about the experiences and needs of people of color or queer people or people with disabilities, whatever, but I can't really represent those. I can't really say, well, here's the impact of this decision. I can't really speak for those people. And so everyone needs to be included in the conversation because people in different social locations are affected differently. And so we practice shared decision-making. So the decision at East Bay Meditation Center tends to involve a lot of people, because when we are making a decision, we're asking ourselves, okay, if we do this, then how does that affect each of the practice groups, the POC practice group, the disability practice group, the queer practice group, the Mahasangha, and how do we get information from those groups? We think a lot about like the sustainability of our community. So our teacher sangha, how do we create sustainability for our teachers? Not our teachers are trying to kind of, as individuals, somehow make a living teaching, but rather they're part of our community. And how do we kind of structure community resources so that it's a sustainable practice? And another aspect of the of shared leadership, in hierarchical systems, where you have in a typical nonprofit, you have the executive director and the staff are below and the board is above. So that one person is a point of a lot of pressure, expectations from below and needs and desires from above, and projections and needs and desires from below. And that puts a lot of pressure on the psychology and capacities of a single person. And that in and of itself, however kind of, woke or open-minded or multicultural or whatever that person is, it puts a lot of stress on that person. And it over time, or in many cases, it can really impair their functioning, impair their capacity to really make decisions that are for the good of the community. Because as long as let's say I'm the executive director, as long as I see myself as responsible, rather than I'm part of a mutually responsible group, then I'm going to take on way more than my share of decision-making power and kind of practices. Because, we're trained to be individuals. We're trained to work alone, to kind of rule things. Whereas this is much more the sense of we are mutually accountable, mutually responsible. And as Mushim was saying, like a very important part of that is shared accountability. Because, for example, our staff, they operate on shared leadership. That is, there is no executive director. They among themselves agree on, these are the goals, here's what we're going to do, here's who's going to do it. And then when someone isn't doing what they need to do, that's something that the whole staff takes up. And they have to be willing to do it. So here's the compass point training, the beauty of it, because the staff can, generatively and kindly and firmly hold each other accountable. They can kind of talk about, well, how do we operate as a staff, and we're not getting where we want to get. And so how do we handle that? And similarly on the board, the leadership Sangha, our decision-making process, it involves a lot of discussion, but we've adopted now the staff process of actually holding tension meetings, meaning to set aside a time where we can say, I'm feeling tension because when you did X, I had that experience, or whatever the tensions are. Because in the conflict avoidance system, then the conflict, it kind of goes underground, and then it goes along the familiar pathways, so that the people, who are of the dominant culture, things happen according to the principles of that culture. Whereas it's to have an inclusive culture under shared leadership, you very explicitly talk together about kind of what is our community, what do we want in our community, and what do we need? And how can everyone be involved and the needs of everyone be met? So we're starting to get questions in the chat. So I would be inclined, Mushim, if you want to say a bit more, but I would be inclined to open the conversation now to questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you. I do want to just quickly say and ask Betsy to please put into the chat a couple of PDFs that you are free to download, and we can also ask to have sent out as part of your resources, a couple of documents. They're very short from East Bay Meditation Center. We're happy to share them with you, so you'll see them in the chat. One is a one-pager on shared leadership that has hyperlinks to wonderful resources. The second are our mindfulness-based principles, operating principles for being able to surface tensions. And then the third thing that I would like to offer that I'll just put into the chat, and if you'd like to copy and paste it for later, is just a kind of a mindful inquiry into a series of questions about what does mindful resistance to dominator structures look and feel like to you? And according to our positionality, we will come up with many different answers if we engage in this as a community dialogue. And I think it's there might be something there that's helpful for us. So thank you, Crystal, for that that opportunity, and would love to hear what our Sangha that's present right now is thinking and feeling.
Okay, so we have a question from John. In my prior experience, the feedback systems that we use to understand are best suited for the dominant culture and those already empowered. I wonder if there are ways to identify and help develop the voices in our community. Yes, there have to be sort of active and inclusive like ongoing conversations, right? Because you can't have like a big group meeting and say, okay, does anybody object to this decision? It's like that is not going to bring out the people who are on the downside of power. So it's creating safe spaces. So for us, that might be the POC Sangha. It might be the Alphabet Sangha. It might be the Everybody, Every Mind Sangha, which is for folks who have chronic illness, chronic pain, disabilities. That is, folks in their own communities would talk together about kind of what the needs are, what the impact of the decision are. And you're right, you have to explicitly develop it. You have to, that needs to be a value. Oh, we haven't heard from Everybody, Every Mind yet. We haven't heard from the teacher side. We haven't heard from these folks. And so like in our minds on the leadership Sangha and on the staff, like we have the whole Sangha in mind. And we have that, oh, there are these various groups, and then there's the Mahasangha that kind of brings it all together. But we need all of these voices to be operating in the community. Andrea, I'd like to speak to the profound ableism in priest training. If disabled people encounter barriers to priesthood, how can a temple or Sangha's leadership represent disability? I also, whoops, now my, all right, now my chat just jumped. But I don't know, Mushim, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I'm one of the teachers and also a member of East Bay Meditation Center's Sunday evening practice group, which is small and mighty, called Every Body, Every Mind Sangha. We say that we're for people with disabilities, chronic pain, chronic illness, and limitations and differences of any sort. So our inside joke is we should be the biggest practice group. We should be, and we're not, because of the stigma attached to self-identifying in these ways. And, you know, if there's someone here who can say, nah, I don't have any differences and limitations, well, good on you. However, as has been pointed out by the disability community, disability justice activists, those of us not, this does not include me, who may self-identify as, well, I'm not a disabled person. And physically, you're called a tab, temporarily able-bodied. As Buddhists, we can recognize impermanence, the big law. Yes, maybe you can do everything you want more or less today. Heaven forbid, does happen. You have a stroke tomorrow. What is your identity? Who are you? What can you do? Where can you go? Where can you even go and eat a meal? All of those things have changed entirely. So ableism, disability, access, I think this is one of the most empowering, amazing avenues of spiritual growth and learning as Buddhists that we can go into. And it is one in which, again, we need to go to the communities that are involved. We don't take this colonialist kind of attitude of, okay, like we know this is what's going to be good for you. No, we need to go to the people who are most affected and say, please tell us. We're not probably going to be able to do everything to please everyone. However, we have a commitment. If we can make it work for you, we're going to make it work for you. And by doing this, we all become so much richer in knowledge, in compassion, in wisdom. I can't even describe how enthusiastic I am about disability access and accommodations. And Crystal as well, radical inclusivity.
So now I'm seeing the rest of this question, you know, appreciating what Rhonda said about coming to clarity about, you know, the limits of our willingness to include. The gaslighting, the expression, the gaslighting of an organization pretending to be inclusive is very painful to experience. This is why it's so important for white dominated sanghas or able-bodied dominated sanghas to really investigate what is it that we are willing to do, not just to give lip service, not to just say, well, you know, gee, we just want everybody to be here, but we're not going to make any changes to make that possible. And that's something that those of us from dominant culture, like that's our inquiry. Like that's for us to decide. There was an earlier question about, you know, maybe white people are just saying we want inclusion to make ourselves feel better. And that's the kind of thing that we really need to think about. Like if that's what we're doing in our sanghas, let's put that out there. Let's not claim to be inclusive if that's not really who we are.
Yes, and this takes a lot from leadership. It means that
yes,
leadership and those who are decision makers, we need to expand to be able to like try to calm down our neural systems if we feel like, oh, geez, people are just attacking us left and right. And we don't have like infinite budget. Help us, help us. We need to be able to really take a breath, create some space, say, I'm in a listening mode. I'm in a deep listening mode. I'm going to put aside my concerns about budget or it's always been this way. Just try to just say, okay, we hear these voices, put them aside and really listen to our communities. And I do want to say, I see Rhonda wants to say something that for me, this includes children and younger people. It has been pointed out in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, which I'm a consultant of, that you know, pretty much everyone has had probably a deep experience of being targeted for oppression if we were ever children. And we know that because so many people self-identify as being survivors of childhood abuse and molestation, children. And so in my own family, I decided many years ago that I needed to live my values. I have one child, and when he was 3 and I was weaning him from breastfeeding, I was 38, and I thought, well, if we're going to have a number 2, got to start working on it. So I called a family meeting, and there was my now ex-husband, my partner at the time, and this 3-year-old child. And I said, what do you all think about having a second child? And I was voted down. We had a discussion. It was a compassionate discussion. And the 3-year-old said, there's no way that I want a sibling. We were living then in the space I am now, which is a 1-bedroom, very tiny apartment rented in Oakland. So there really was no space for a second child. But I was thinking, wow, you know, biologically, if I'm going to do it, I've got to do it now. And so we had a really nice family meeting. And I said, I have been voted down, and I will abide by the will of this community.
Thank you, Rhonda.
I just love listening to that. I mean, right? Staying in alignment with those values. Every voice matters. I mean, you know, there's some edge to that. I'm going to place in the chat, if I can, this quote that was coming up for me as I was thinking about the challenge of really looking at our structures, seeing more clearly if the structures we've embedded, though neutral in their language and in their, maybe even in their intended impact, have a disparate impact on different types of people. And this quote from Anatole France, everyone may be familiar with it, the law and its majestic equality forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under the bridges, to beg in the streets and to steal their bread, right? The law, in other words, it's equal. It's just having a disparate impact on the poor, right? And so similarly, we might have these systems and structures that are totally coming from a kind of a place of all humans that have a disparate impact on folks. And so being courageous and able to say, they are having a disparate impact. These policies, practices, this received way of interpreting the traditions, et cetera, et cetera. And that can maybe hard for people to say and like stand in the clarity of that. And the ouch of that, like, ooh, we said that out loud. Is it true? Is it true that this is just the way it is and we're not going to be, and we feel comfortable being kind of exclusive? Some people may say, yes, it is true. But others may say, you know what, as I hear that out loud and I sit with that, I really want to see if there might be some way that we could alter at least some of, or some aspect of this could be interpreted a little differently, right? In other words, it could create a space for inquiry. And that is what I think we're sort of supporting here. Not shaming or blaming, but expanding the space for inquiring on the, you know, what's possible here. And thank you all for being in this really juicy, rich place, for being in reflection on what might be possible. It's not easy necessarily, but I think this is why we need a little more time. So we've got to notice when we're grasping after, like, we need the answer now. And instead, can we be a part of creating a space where we together can come back after these 5 classes are over? How will we continue asking this kind of good question and creating space for, you know, for experimentation a little?
Yeah, because I think it's a planned, intentional conversation, right? It doesn't just happen. There needs to be a community an inquiry among the community. Like, is everybody feeling like they're included? You know, what needs are we not seeing? What are some other needs that we might be able to meet?
For myself, I want to be clear, I am not at all advocating taking a tourist approach. I don't think we can progress in our practice unless we choose a path and we begin to go deeper and encounter the obstacles and the contradictions and like, wait a minute, really? That's so much a part of it. And at the same time for myself, I don't expect to get all of my practice needs met from any one Sangha. I really do not. I guess I'm polyamorous. And,
Can we include that too?
Sure. And from East Bay Meditation, that's a dimension of diversity. From East Bay Meditation Center, I do expect, our practices and policies to align with our stated values. And that's an ongoing thing. And then if I go into one of the Zen groups or the Zen lineages, there is a focus, there is a heritage, and I'm going to accept the limitations of that in order to gain also the riches that are there. However, I'm not going to limit myself to that because that's not complete for me. I just popped into a few minutes late into this class from a previous class I just taught through East Bay Meditation Center, introducing Jodo Shinshu Buddhism to the East Bay Meditation generalists.
Whoops, you just muted yourself.
Thank you. And as I said, at the end, I said, as a Buddhist practitioner, I am so happy. I can't believe it. I've been working year after year to bridge these communities. And now, as a religious Buddhist, I can show up and say what I usually can't say in a lot of the circles I'm in. Where would we be without the primal vow? Where would we be without the primal vow? And just being able to say that, I felt like so fabulous. So, as we can really enrich one another, we can also stay separate and do our work of going deeper. It's being able to open up these braver spaces, as Rhonda and Crystal are pointing out, that I feel is a skill set that we can all acquire.
Thank you. What other comments or questions do people have? We have another few minutes.
Well, I also want to add that after I came back from Korea, I was just like lying low and raising my kid for a while. And then I had interfaced with the most well-known Korean Zen teacher, Seung-san Sinim. And and so I remember he was in hospital, and I found that out, and I'd had a couple of chances to interact with him as a teacher. He was great. So I sent him a card saying, "Oh, Sinem, I hope that you feel better soon." And I immediately got a card back from him, which was very unexpected because I was not one of his long-term students. And but he had his eye on me. I knew that. And he said very clearly, he said, your way, Mushim, is going to be a friend to many temples and organizations. However, you don't need to attach yourself to any of them. He said, come and go, learn as you go. And then he said in his way, he said, and little by little, you will attain universal cookie taste. So it's a delicious process to be a friend to many sanghas. I mean, I do say EBMC is my home temple, and it is. However, my approach is I want to learn as much as possible about the Buddha Dharma and the ways in which we're different as well as the same.
That inclusion isn't so much about inviting diverse people in as being sure that the experience they have when they arrive is actually open and welcoming to them. Because otherwise, it certainly is tokenism. And you don't want to be in the position of saying, oh, please come, we want everybody here, unless you're having the conversations about, well, how do we make all these people feel welcome? How are we defining who we are, and how can we make it clear? Here's what you can expect here with us, rather than, we want this many of those people and that many of these people. Just saying that oftentimes I hear people talk as if our goal is to get lots of people of color into a white dominated Sangha. And that may be a goal, but that's not the means. That's not the practice. The practice is one of kind of creating a Sangha that undermines the sort of the dominator culture and actually is able to make space for a diverse community. And then the people who do come don't have the, oh, I'm the only one experience, which is such a hard and difficult experience.
On the other hand, of course, racism is not going to be eradicated overnight. So again, we have to be deepening our ability to stay with this as an aspect of our practice, at least in my humble view. And there's so many different ways we can do some of the work of creating spaces that are more inclusive, preparing in advance, right? Proactively using our power to minimize harm. So thinking about not only how we meet individuals, which is really, really important. Thank you so much, Crystal, for naming that, and others, right? And Devin as well. But also, how are we in relationship to the communities that comprise our natural, if you will, environment or the space that we're in? How are we in relationship to the actual bodies who are here in the communities, if you will, that we might relate to? So again, from the white and dominant and elitist perspectives that we're all imbibing, or else we wouldn't be here, we tend to think of these things very individualistically. What am I doing and how can I make people feel welcome? Good and important. But also just to, how am I helping meet that one Black woman? Good and important. But also, how am I in relationship to these communities around me and in the broader world? And what do I really need to keep doing to heal those separations and to like transform what I was trained about those groups to help prepare this space? Those are the types of things I think we can inquire together about on a long-term basis.
And we also do have to learn how to take care of ourselves and cultivate our own resilience. I mean, one good thing I do feel that comes from Zen training is that old story about you look to the left and you get hit by the stick. Then you look to the right and you get hit by the stick. Because none of us can come out of this without having that experience many times. Like I remember years ago, there was some person who was not in a wheelchair who said, it's incredibly ableist and it's horrible. We shouldn't say, do you want to go out for a walk? Or we can't just say, because not everyone can walk. And I thought, well, yeah, that's true. And this person was very vehement. And then I talked to a member of our Sangha who is in a wheelchair who said, oh, I don't feel that way at all. Sometimes I'll say I'm going to go out for a walk if I'm going to go out and roll around in my wheelchair. So it is maddening. There is usually no one answer. And people are often really strong, like it must be this way. We must only use this one word or two words, and this is the only way it is. And then someone else who might be in that community that is targeted for oppression will say, no, I don't feel that way at all. You can use those words. I'm fine with it. So then one feels, well, what the heck? I'm being attacked from all sides, or I'm getting all this different information. What do I do? And that's a very good question for us to be able to be with. These days, the universe is called the multiverse. There isn't just one. It's not uni, it's multi. And when we're able to relax into that multiverse, yes, exactly, koan practice can help us with that. We are in a multiverse, and how do we, in a certain way, learn that if we feel we're being kind of torn apart from different directions, how do we learn how to just sit back and have a cold drink and put up our feet and say, well, that was a good day.
We are running out of time. And so at this point, I'm going to hand it to you, Rhonda, to finish us.
Thank you so very much. I just put in reflecting on Mushim's beautiful final reflections there. Yes, we all have a piece of the work. We all have a piece of the joy too. We all have a piece of the effort to create spaces where we can all belong. We all have a piece of the realizations that support us in feeling our inherent belonging, wherever we are on the planet. So thank you. And I just want to invite us together to pause, sense into the benefit of this time that we've shared for each of us, our own body, being, spirit. My heart, I can tell you, is full. My spirit full of gratitude for each of you. And of course, my beautiful co-teachers and team, but all of you who have been my co-teachers and team through these sessions. Thank you, each and every one of you. And may the benefit of our time together in this moment spontaneously, let's imagine, be a part of the healing that's being called forth in the world and ripple and continue to be a part of that healing in ways seen and unseen, known and unknown. Thank you all. Until we see each other again next Saturday, be well, be safe, know that you're connected, and let your light shine in this world where we need all your lights.